Thank you very much, Torsten. It's always a pleasure to be here, and even more this year, after some difficult times, obviously. It's always a pleasure and a very interesting moment to share with colleagues of the road markings and the road industry. Well, if you look at the title of my presentation, maybe the title is a little bit ambitious because I can't see through the crystal ball and I don't know. I don't get the answer of what the road infrastructure and the impact of new mobility will be by 2030, but we can at least start to envisage some scenarios, very possible scenarios for the future. I will start with some brief statements. No mobility without roads. Roads are really at the core of mobility. And we can see that most of the passenger and freight transport depend on roads. And this happens in normal times, but also in critical moments, and I will get back to that particularity later on. According to the statistics that we publish every year with the ERF, the inland passenger transport in the EU on road represents 71.7, almost 72% of the whole transport for passenger, and for freight it's 72.1%. And this is the current situation, but what we see is that it is very likely that this sort of proportion will remain similar in the future. When I talked about normal times and more special ones, obviously, I was referring to some moments of the COVID-19 crisis and lockdowns. But what we could see, and this is really specific to the road, is that during these difficult moments, road was the mode of transport that ensured an efficient, safe, and quick delivery of all essential goods and services, including to the most remote areas, and that was quite important in this moment of crisis, with the guarantee of mobility for all the services, emergency services, and urgent interventions. And in that case, we could see that really road is and remain the main support for mobility. But what we could also notice, and that's also before the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdowns, is that we could see the emergence of new mobility models, new mobility patterns, new usages, new behaviors, and more particularly in the sector of the connected and autonomous mobility, of the electric and carbon-free mobility or mobility with less levels of emission, and certainly more specifically in urban area with the soft and active mobility. When we talk about soft and active mobility, we talk about walking, cycling, scooters, for example. So in front of this change in the mobility behaviors, with some partner organizations, SICA, Contractors Association, the National French Public Works Association, the International Europe Constructions Federation, and Route de France, we initiated in 2019 an international benchmark study which covered 21 countries worldwide, where we wanted to see what the impact of those new mobility uses could have on the road infrastructure and its equipment. And in that sense, road infrastructure and its equipment, road marking is also an essential element and equipment of the road infrastructure. And that was, of course, before the crisis, as we started it in 2019, before the crisis linked to the COVID-19. Some first findings that we found interesting, there was this different integration of new mobility in Europe, where we could see a difference between mostly northern countries, Scandinavia, Germany, UK, the Netherlands, compared to other EU countries, more specifically for what we regarded the electric and connected mobility. Some countries were more advanced. And generally for Europe, what appeared to be the trend was not a revolution, but a sort of adaptation of the road facilities and its equipment, whereas in other countries, the approach is much more global. The role of public authorities in the different regions of the world is also important. If you look at the US, for example, you have a strong influence of the GAFA. In Asia, and more particularly in China, you have a very, very strong presence of the public authorities, more partnerships in Europe. There's also different types of expectations regarding the place of the road infrastructure by the users. For example, in Europe, people tend to be more focusing on safety aspect, whereas in the US, for example, they more want to have a sort of global type of services coming from the road with other modes of transport. In South America, one important point is to really bring the road to the most remote points so they can also benefit from the mobility using the road. So different levels of expectations in the different areas of the world. For Europe, one of the main lessons is that, unfortunately, the role of the road infrastructure is generally underestimated. And despite its central role for the new mobility and also what is becoming more and more important, everything which is related to the energy transition and the ecological transition in relation, for example, with the European Green Deal, there is an underestimation of the role of the road. And at the same time, the maintenance and the adaptation of the existing road infrastructure is definitely necessary if we want to develop a new mobility, which requires significant levels of investment to accompany the change, which maybe we could find into the European recovery plans and the sustainable policies at European level, but we'll see that it's not always the case, unfortunately. So this is the benchmark study that was published last year. Then, after the publication of this benchmark study, we said, well, things are changing, really. Well, okay. And we might be interested to see what the COVID situation has modified compared to the first phase of that benchmark study. And we thought we could go for a post-COVID study. Unfortunately, what we see is that we are still not apparently in the post-COVID, but anyway, the COVID crisis had an impact, and also on the mobility patterns, generally speaking, the road usages, the importance of teleworking, a strong decrease of the presence of cars in urban areas, a very strong development of soft mobility in urban area, pedestrians, bicycles, scooters, on top, due to the fact that people also were very reluctant to use public transport, not to be in presence of too many people, the rise of of new technologies, digitals, and the growing importance of climate issues. So the objective of that second phase was to reflect the future of mobility in a post-COVID era with analyzing the perspectives for land transport and what it would be also for operators, considering also the national recovery and resilience plans. in line with the different European policies like the Fit for 55 package, with the objective of reducing the emission level by 55% in 2030. And that second part covered 10 countries in the European Union, plus UK. Before, we could have said that we were covering 11 countries from the European Union, but unfortunately, in the meantime, the Brexit happened, so we had EU and the UK. So that second phase was very focused on the environmental impact of road transport, because there's a trend, generally speaking, which seems to say that road transport is anyway not good. If you talk about the impact of transport, many people say road transport is not good, and we would prefer to have a modal shift towards railway, unfortunately. But at the same time, there are some progresses and some evolutions that the road transport can have and can experiment. For example, with the development of new types of energies like electricity, hydrogen, and even though for this same aspect, we obviously notice large differences between different countries in Europe, mainly, let's say, northern countries which are more advanced, some countries like France, Italy, Spain, which are more or less in the middle, and the other countries in Europe which are really long behind. What we also saw, that there was a will of more support for public transport and to develop soft mobility, particularly for the infrastructure in urban area, which could be also an opportunity for our sector that we will have to maybe focus where the opportunities are more concentrated. Digitalization and the 5G deployment is also one of the elements that will have an impact on the road infrastructure in the future. Maybe a more interesting point is about the reforms that want to be introduced in terms of public procurement processes and public works that could simplify these procedures and maybe ease the possibility of getting projects implemented, or at least speeding up the implementation. As I said, unfortunately, a trend of prioritizing the railway, more specifically for the freight transport. And in most of the cases, what we saw is that, unfortunately, road transport seems to remain the most neglected mode of transport for many member states. And this is also due to the fact that presenting their proposal of schemes for the resilience and recovery plans, many of the member states focus more on the rail than on the road. There are some other impacts that will also play a role in the future. Like recently, the Flemish government in Belgium has decided to ban fossil fuel vehicles in the near future. Will it be possible or not? It's also a question of, will we have the right infrastructure to provide the other sources of energy? More pressure from the transport users and from the citizens for the decarbonation, the shared mobility. Of course, there will be less vehicle ownership and more vehicle sharing. A vision of more integrated mobility with other modes. This means that the road will also have to incorporate in its infrastructure the possible cooperation with the other modes. But in general, very few reference to the road infrastructure, and more particularly for everything which is related to the maintenance, the preservation, the adaptation, and the improvement of the road infrastructure. So this is the second part of the benchmark study, which is freely available from the website of the ERF. So as a conclusion, when we look at the road infrastructure and new mobility, one thing is that for sure, the road infrastructure, generally speaking, will have to be more flexible, more capable of adapting to new situations, and it has given the evidence that it was able to do so at the beginning of the crisis of COVID. More resilience, and this englobes all the aspects of climate change, more resilient, maybe self-healing, more connected, with a possibility of multifunctional services. Maybe the road will become an energy supplier also in the future. Definitely it will be greener, but what is really important is that the road infrastructure and its equipment, here I'm talking also about road markings, this has to be to provide the same level of service for all the users, are they human or traditional road users, and the connected vehicles that will more and more be present on our roads. But the transition period might last very long. So this is also important that the quality of road markings remain good. This requires investment, a lot of investment, and as a conclusion, I would say that as long as there are vehicles and people using land transport, road infrastructure will need to be there, maybe in a different way, more virtual or incorporating more virtual elements, and an infrastructure, road infrastructure, land infrastructure is necessary, unless our vehicles will stop driving and they will just fly. But even though if they ever fly, a road infrastructure will still be required. This comes from a comic strip that I used to read when I was a kid, and this is a flying car having a sort of incident with the traditional one, so the importance of road infrastructure is still evident for all of us. Thank you very much for your attention.